Good afternoon, everyone. 2 o'clock is here, and we will get started with the special Technical Advisory Committee meeting of July 9th. My name is Herb Smart. I'm a member of the Technical Advisory Committee, and I will be hosting the meeting before we kick it over to Lacey. So just a couple reminders, please don't put the call on hold. Please go on mute if you wish to speak. Don't forget to unmute when you would like to speak. It'd be nice if you could announce yourself before you speak, unless you have a really recognizable voice, and we'll use it for record keeping purposes. Just like our in-person TAC meetings that have been held over the past, this venue has members of the TAC and also members of the public. We're going to follow the agenda. There's a public participation item, and some people are listening on the phone. Some people are listening from their computer. Some people are using their cell phone and can view the slides. Just keep that in mind. Feel free to use our chat feature if you like. We'll monitor it the best we can. And I'll add at the end that this meeting is being recorded. The materials have been posted on the turlockgroundwater.org site. There's a couple different materials I'll note today. There's a presentation from Todd Groundwater, which is up there, along with 2 memos on specific matters that are up there that are going to get referenced a lot today as well. So with that being said, I will kick things over now to Lacey or any other member of the TAC leadership that's looking to lead the meeting today.
So Herb, this is Michael. Lacey can't make it today, so I'll be filling in for her as chair of the West Turlock Technical Advisory Committee. So first on the agenda, we have to make sure we have a quorum. So maybe we can go around and introduce ourselves. I know it's tricky via Zoom, but as this is an official meeting of the Brown Act, we have to make sure we do have a quorum in case we need to take some actions today. So with that, and I don't have a list of members in front of me, just want to kind of free form it and introduce yourselves, and we'll keep track of which agency you're with to see if we have a quorum. So again, my name is Michael Cook. I am the chair and I'm with the Turlock Irrigation District. Anybody else from Turlock Irrigation District on?
Hi, this is Debbie Liebersbach with the TID.
We have Herb. Okay, what about Stanislaus County?
Walt Ward is here for Stanislaus County.
Okay, Merced County?
Brody Patterson is here. I am the new alternate for Merced County, so I'm taking Lacey's spot today.
Well, congratulations, Brody, and welcome aboard. City of Modesto?
This is Jim Alves for City of Modesto.
Okay. City of Ceres? No from Ceres. City of Turlock? No from Turlock. Now I'm starting to struggle. Keys? Keys CSD? Anyone from Denair?
Yeah, I'm here, Michael. David from Denair CSD.
David, welcome.
Thank you.
Hilmar County Water District. No Curtis. Man, we never get a second for emotions today with no Curtis. Okay, anybody else that I've forgotten?
Leandro, Delhi County Water District.
Leandro, welcome. Thank you. Sorry for forgetting you. Anybody else? Okay, so I make that for, we have TID, Stan County, Merced County, City of Modesto, Denair CSD, Delhi County Water District. 6. So that's 6 people. I'm trying to remember, a quorum is 6 or 7. Debbie or Valerie, can you help me out?
Michael, do you hear me?
Yeah.
This is Allie. Turlock's here.
Oh, Turlock's wonderful. I thought I recognized that voice. So we have a quorum here on the west side. Kevin, do you want to, is Kevin here?
Yes, I am, Michael. Thank you.
Run the quorum for the east side.
Sure. I heard Walt, so Walt's here. Thank you, Walt.
Dennis from Belico Cortez.
There you are. Thank you, Dennis. Anybody else from the east side? Well, Brody is there.
Yeah, Kevin, you got Brody here from Merced County.
Right. So we have a quorum with Dennis, Ward, myself, and I can't remember, Brody, if you're eligible to make the quorum, but I think you are.
Okay, so it's 2:05. We're calling this meeting to orders. We have a quorum of both technical advisory committees, so the joint TAC can meet and take action. The first item on our agenda is item number 4, public participation. This is time set aside for members of the public to address the technical advisory committee on any item of interest that's within our subject matter. If it's an item further down on the agenda, maybe hold your comments until then, but you're welcome to make any comments right now that aren't necessarily identified on the agenda at this time. So any comments from the public? Going once, going twice. Okay, no comments from the public for items not on the agenda. So moving on to item number 5. This is a summary of yesterday's community workshops. We had one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And I believe, who's doing that one for us? Is that Herb?
Yeah,
Taking that one for us?
It's going to be me, Michael. Thanks. And then, others were there and they could chime in when I get done as well. And I know Kevin's on the line and he was pivotal in that too. So I'll just give a couple pieces of information and we can keep the conversation going. So we had 2 workshops yesterday and we're still formulating like a formal report on it, but I have some general information right now that I typed up. There were 37 stakeholders who attended across 2 different workshops. There was an 11 o'clock, which had 24 people attend, and a 5 o'clock, which had 13. Some people were there. I can't remember names offhand. I'm going to need to go back through the list, but I know there were some people there, names who I have not necessarily seen at the discussion table thus far. So that's a success, seeing some new names. Kevin and myself covered things like the GSP timeline, sustainability indicators, models, and water budgets at a little bit more of a higher level than Phyllis will go through on a lot of things, or has went through when discussing the groundwater sustainability plan. So that was good. We covered those things. And we also did a little drive through of our website to show people where things are located. It's been about a year, it's been actually a little more than, I want to say more like 15 months since we last were in front of people for a community workshop. And so it was good to do that. And it was good to remind people of where we were at and where we're going in the process. We encourage people to sign up for our newsletter, submit questions, follow us on social media, and get informed in a lot of the conversations that are happening right now, including the ones that are going to occur after this item, after we start getting into other things for this meeting here. There were several polls. Nothing was really surprising in the polls that were answered. There was people saying we were delivering the right amount of information for the type of workshop. People were generally concerned with pumping reductions that may or may not come. And as far as the makeup of the people who attended, it's pretty fair to say they were mostly farmers, government agencies, and then a few NGOs. There were some municipal customers too. But it was a good mix of people, but mostly the same types that we've seen at past meetings for the most part. We have it posted on YouTube. We live streamed it on YouTube as well as being in Zoom when people registered. So if anyone on this call has missed it or was there and wanted to kind of check out a few things, it's available on the Turlock Groundwater YouTube channel. And I'll stop there and see if Kevin wants to add anything, or if anyone else that was part of that wants to provide any thoughts.
Thanks, Herb. This is Kevin. Just to add a couple of things, I think you and Megan and Julia just did a magnificent job. I really appreciate the expertise that you 3 bring to the table. It makes me look good, in my opinion, anyhow. I think we did get the message across, and I was really excited about what happened in the afternoon session. We got a couple of local people to ask a lot of really, really good questions, other than the usual ones we get. And so we had a nice discussion there. So I'll look forward to future opportunities to interact with the public and see if we can, get the word out that what we're doing here needs to be watched and needs to be, and we need their input to make it a better plan. So I think you guys are doing a wonderful job.
Thanks, Kevin. And also likewise to you as well. That was good for everybody around. It was a good team effort. I'll note that we now move this was the genesis of the ad hoc communications group that does things here and there for the technical advisory committee. And now we're going to try and look forward to maybe holding another set of workshops, because it's pretty low overhead holding a virtual workshop. So will I now, looking at something maybe August, I'm just putting a date out there, maybe mid-August, late August, have some virtual workshop to cover something else. There were a few things that were mentioned as possible options, and so we can move into that space now and start to kind of see what we can do with that, and be able to provide another level of engagement on top of these TAC meetings, and then on top of regular GSA board meetings. So that's kind of the next step we're looking forward to, and looking forward to grow our attendance and interest in GSP development activities.
Thank you, Herb. And talking of attendance and interest, we have a big group on today. I finally figured out how to pop up the list of participants. And it's been our custom at these meetings for members of the public, if they'd like to do so, to introduce themselves. So we're welcome to do that now. If you'd like to unmute everybody, Herb, so people can introduce themselves. That would be great. Now's the time.
Yeah, everybody can control their own mute unless things get a little unruly and I have to do it, which hasn't had to happen in the past. So now would be the time if people want to unmute themselves and share who they are, where they're from.
I sense reticence. I see Roger.
Milt.
Milt. Welcome, Milt.
Yes, Milt Treeweiler, Turlock citizen. Welcome, Michael. Like to see you in the chair. That's great.
Okay. Thanks for going first, Milt, breaking the ice.
Brianne Ramus, Merced County Farm Bureau.
Lindsay Hofstein, Turlock resident.
Sarah Baskins, Agus Capital.
You got John Lambie, consultant to East Turlock Subbasin GSA.
Brett Calkins, farmer.
Matt Brady, South Valley Farms.
Okay, anybody else? I think everybody's had a chance. It's okay to be anonymous, that's fine, but just in the interest of helping us participate as a better group under these difficult circumstances. So thank you, everybody. Okay, moving on to item number 6, project update on the development of the proposed water budgets. Oh, Herbie, killing me. And
I'm going to pull it back up.
And sustainable yield analysis. Now I got to open in another document.
Give me a second. I was just trying to get, I know Phyllis is next, and so I wanted to pull it up, but there she goes. She's going to share her screen.
Anyway, so we'll have a brief discussion of the modeling status and any outstanding data we need to get to Phyllis Stannon, who's our consultant with Todd Groundwater. Welcome, Phyllis.
Phyllis,
okay, great.
Oh, good.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm working with new earbuds, and this is my second Zoom issue, so I'm moving along here. Okay, thank you, everyone. It's so nice to see you again. We have 2 agenda items that we're going to summarize quickly for you today. Agenda item number 6 is a review of our projected water budgets analysis that we're doing. A quick update on where we are with respect to that project. And then item number 7 continues our ongoing discussions with sustainable management criteria. We're going to talk a little bit about definition of undesirable results and review some of the information that was provided in the land subsidence draft technical memorandum. So let's get going with these projected water budgets first. Going the wrong way here. Let's see if I can go the other way. Okay, great. So just as a reminder, what we're doing here is we are projecting 50 years into the future using 50 years of past hydrology that you see represented by the precipitation graphs on this slide. Essentially, we are going from 1969 through 2018 with our hydrology. And on top of this, we are superimposing in our groundwater model projected operations that we will see in the subbasin for the future. And that will help determine what our water budgets look like as we go forward. We had talked about data requests, and one of the key pieces of data that's going into this analysis is coming from the Turlock Irrigation District. Because of their ongoing operation of Don Pedro Reservoir and their operation of the Tuolumne River, they have, through their FERC relicensing program, a lot of information on operation of releases from the reservoir going forward into the future. And they are working with us to make sure that that information and the future operations are incorporated into the model so that we can get more accurate projected water budgets for the future. We already have information from Merced ID with respect to that in the model. So this is going to be just the other key piece of the information that's going in. At this point in time, we're assuming that we will continue into the future the current land use and cropping patterns that we have in the subbasin. If either GSA thinks that there's going to be significant changes in land use or cropping patterns going forward, then if you could let the modeling team know ASAP through me, we would really appreciate it. But I think at this point, this is what is typically done in many of the subbasins through SGMA, is that we simply project the current land use and cropping patterns moving forward. The urban data is something that we had talked about on several occasions as needing, and we have pulled information both from the state as well as the local urban water management plans to develop some population growth curves for the model. So this will give us a better understanding of how urban water use might change in the future. First, looking at population growth. You can see generally that what we have here is our historical time period that's already in the model through 2015. And then using information in each one of our urban communities' urban water management plan, if applicable, we input information for 2015, 2020, and then out to, excuse me, I'm going to go back to this, out to the 2040 planning horizon that's usually associated with the urban water management plan process. So you can see the change in population growth in the subbasin that we're projecting for the future projected water budgets. Also associated with that is a per capita water use for each one of the urban communities that you see listed here. We have a lot of perturbations, as you can see here. Some of this is related to less than great data going back, as you can see, in time back into the 1990s. But we do see the conservation efforts that the urban communities have been through with respect to the 20 by 2020 and other state regulations and mandates. And as a result of that, we have information from the urban water management plans on this period of time, which is really changing some of the per capita water use going forward. And then we've pulled from the urban water management plans per capita water use, and you can see that we would run that out and apply that to the population growth that we just looked at on the previous slide for the 50-year projected period. Now, I know that everyone is already in the process of updating these urban water management plans. It always seems like that the technical analysis in these long-term projects runs a little bit behind the planning process. And I know that these plans are not yet available, they're not yet updated, but if we could ask our urban communities to simply take a look at these 2 slides, you can contact me and I can provide you with additional information if that would be helpful to you. But what we'd like to do is to get your okay for the per capita water use and also for the projected growth that we are using from your urban water management plans. So if we don't hear back from you, we're going to assume we're good and we're going to move this forward. The one thing we are going to also want to talk to the urban communities about is whether or not some of this growth that we see on this slide here is going to change land use. For example, is this growth going to occur in currently undeveloped areas, or is it more likely to occur in, it might even occur within developed areas and just be an increase in density of growth? But it also could potentially occur in some of the surrounding farmlands. And if the urbanization of agricultural lands are going to change, then land use would change going into the future. Not by a lot perhaps, but by some small amount that we would like to capture in our projected water budgets going forward. So the sort of 3 things we're asking from the urban communities is to check our assumptions for your population growth, check our assumptions, I keep going the wrong way here, check our assumptions for the per capita water use, and then also let us know if we feel like that the growth is going to occur on agricultural lands and might result in urbanization of some agricultural properties. Okay, so that is that's where we're headed with the projected water budget. We're on a tight schedule for this, predominantly because we've recognized that this information from the projected water budgets is really going to help frame our sustainable management criteria discussions. As we have gone through the discussions over the last several months, I've tried to talk about how the technical team can assist everyone in better understanding and better moving forward with the selection of sustainable management criteria. What we've realized is really it's this projected water budgets and the sustainable yield of the groundwater basin that's really, I think, going to drive a lot of our approaches to the sustainable management criteria. So we're pushing forward on this. We have an August deadline for ourselves internally here to bring this back to the TAC. This doesn't give us a lot of time to get anything modified within the model. So if anyone from the urban areas has any input on this at all, we would certainly appreciate you contacting us. All right, so I'm just going to move forward now onto agenda item number 7 and talk a little bit about sustainable management criteria.
Phyllis, excuse me,
Yes.
Phyllis, I'm sorry. I do have a question
Please.
on this last portion, the framework for a definition of undesirable results. And this is Milt Treeweiler.
Yes.
And my question pertains to the sustainable yield on page 6 of the handout or the information you provided, the draft memorandum, July
Yes.
8th, 2020.
Yes.
And what I want to read is here, it says historical water budgets indicate overdraft conditions with a deficit of about 65,000 acre feet per year. Projected water budgets and sustainable yield analysis are being developed to provide a target deficit to use the balance of subbasins. So here's what I have here. How will it be possible to reach a sustainable point where we're already unsustainable at 65,000 acre feet per year when we're dealing with global climate change and it's making the western area of the US become a much drier area? So where is the water to develop a sustainable level going to come from?
Well, it's a good question. And as we begin to develop a lot of these projects and management actions as associated with this, we are hoping very much to find not only recharge projects, but ways to optimize the water use. that this is a little bit of a hill to climb for us, and we are going to do everything we can to see if optimization of our water resources that are available to us can occur. We certainly have opportunities, I think, for additional recharge and a little bit more optimization. So I don't want to begin to presume our circumstances. I'd like to just move the projected water budgets forward first and sort of see where we land. And I do know that we've been working internally with a lot of the member agencies in the subbasin already, who already have some projects in mind. And so there's often more opportunities than you think. So give us a chance to get through this process first, Milt, and see where we.
Yes, I understand that. I mean, I'm just bringing up the reality of global climate change is making the western area of the U.S. drier. And this is straight from California state scientists. I mean, it's coming from NOAA, it's coming from California scientists. We had a speaker come to Modesto Junior College about a year and a half ago, and he was actually showing what will be occurring here in the Central Valley because of global climate change. And, you know, the only solution that I've seen proposed that's a practical solution, because this water has to come from somewhere, and as it gets drier, there's going to be less water, is the fallowing of some farmland. That seems to be the only solution. We're going to have to fallow some of the farmland in our subbasin.
Well, before we get there, let's just go back a couple of steps and consider a couple of things. So first of all, we absolutely are going to be incorporated climate change scenarios into our projected water budgets. That's actually required by the regulations, and guidance is provided to us from the Department of Water Resources. We haven't finished the analysis yet, so I don't want to jump to conclusions for the Tuolumne, but we certainly have seen when we did the critically overdrafted basins, we saw that climate change absolutely alters the pattern of river flows, and it also alters the pattern of rainfall. But in some cases, the decreases are not quite the huge percentages that you might suspect. Rather, what you usually have is a bit of change in timing. And we saw, for example, on the Kern River, that when we have peak flows in the historical time period, somewhere in April, now we're going to start seeing peak flows in February. At a time when the water is perhaps not needed as much as it's needed in April. And so as a result of that, the subbasin began to put together various projects and actions in order to have some way of storing that water either underground or on the surface, and allowing us to be a little better with the timing of the water supply. So it isn't as if there isn't anything to do. And we certainly want to maximize our water supplies, and we want to optimize recharge in the subbasin. And just hang in there. I know it's difficult to go through this whole process with all of us, but when we get to management actions, I think you'll see there's a little more flexibility than you might think.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Thank you, Milt. I always appreciate it.
And I will have more to say and present on this subject later. Thank you. Not today, but another time.
That'd be great. We always appreciate your input very much. Okay, so moving along on item number 7. This is a bit of a review, but some of the Joint TAC members asked me if we could go back through a few of the key Sigma concepts. These are all new terms, and we're all just used to working with them now for the first time. And as a result of that, sometimes it's better to hear them, even if it's over and over again, even though I've showed this material before. Hang in there with me, because every time we talk about it, we might pick up some nuance associated with it. Here's a chart you've seen before. This is an example of how water levels could potentially be analyzed in the future with respect to the sustainable management criteria specifically looking here at the minimum threshold. So this is an example of a well that has seen a rather sharp decline in water levels over time, over some historical period that you can see here, moving into the Sigma benchmark date of January 1st, 2015, when we all sort of began this process. At that point, this theoretical subbasin, in the same way that this Turlock subbasin, pulled all of the information in, analyzed what the historical water budgets might look like with respect to these water level declines, and then developed a path forward based on their own projected water budgets. And what they determined is that really, in order to arrest these declines and in order to operate the basin sustainably, the subbasin determined that they had a minimum threshold, which is just essentially shown here by this sort of orange line. And this is a specific water level at this specific well's location. And it essentially says we don't quite have water level, we don't quite yet have undesirable results, but we certainly need to arrest this decline. And it's going to take us a little bit of time to do that. And so even by the 2020 submission date, for our purposes, this is 2022 now, we still are going to see some decline over that period of time. That would be essentially now. Luckily, we've had 2017 and 2019 be relatively wet years, so that was able to stabilize our water levels a little bit recently. But in this particular theoretical case, they've said in order to avoid falling below this minimum threshold line in the future, meaning out into the planning horizon, we need to implement management actions. But everything won't happen today. And so it's going to take a little bit of time for this to occur. So we recognize that while we're putting this in place, if we get into a drought situation in the future, we're in the future now, remember, water levels might decline below this minimum threshold, but we won't let it decline far. And we are going to recognize that that's going to occur by identifying interim milestones. And this just recognizes and acknowledges that there's going to be time needed to implement projects. Now, this diagram is a specific situation in a theoretical case. It's not our case. We have already identified that even at these levels, which we've seen in 2015, that we've had some adverse impacts to water supply wells. And as a result of that, our minimum threshold may not be down here. We may need to put our minimum threshold a little bit higher. Even if we are below that minimum threshold now and at the time of submission, we will need to turn that back around and achieve that higher goal. So this example is just one way of looking at it, and in our subbasin we may be a little bit different. But it is an instructive diagram to kind of help us with the terms. So here we have a similar diagram to the one we saw before, when we have still an orange line that we have determined to be our minimum threshold in this example. And I have labeled this pink area in both of these diagrams as undesirable results, because the definition of undesirable results is when we exceed our minimum threshold. In other words, in this case, when we go below it. And it doesn't necessarily mean below at one time at one well. There's an option for a combination approach, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. But sticking with this diagram for a minute, let's look at what we're seeing here. So here we have the adoption date of the GSP, and again, ours is 2022. Some of these diagrams were put together early, and some of them have our timeline on it, and some of them still have the critically overdrafted groundwater basins on it. But if you can just imagine that this is 2022 for us, then as we move into implementation, we can say that we recognize that water levels may decline if we get into a multi-year drought in our implementation period while we're busy implementing our projects and our management actions. So we might set an interim milestone a little below our minimum threshold. And if we do that, and if we recognize and predict that that might be where we're headed, then that is not defined as undesirable results, even though we have an exceedance of this minimum threshold. But we do have to pull out of it. We do have to stabilize, and we do have to get above our minimum threshold going forward. And we might think that we might be able to do that by the second interim milestone. In this particular case, they set the interim milestone close to or just above the minimum threshold. And then finally, toward the end of the period, 2040, we need to have achieved this. By the end of the period, the prediction here is with interim milestone number 3, that we are now recovering our water levels to be above the minimum threshold. And then finally, getting to this measurable objective. A measurable objective can be looked at as just an operational target to make sure that minimum threshold exceedances are avoided in the future. It doesn't mean you have to be at the minimum measurable objective all the time, and certainly you probably can't be at the measurable objective over time. It just means that this is some sort of an average target, and it also is a little bit, or can be used a little bit as a warning sign, or if you begin to fall below your measurable objective, then you can see, of course, you're getting closer to your minimum threshold. So these are sort of 2 targets that you'll be looking at for each one of the GSP monitoring wells that we have in our network. And we'll also be setting interim milestones associated with those. So I know that we haven't talked about monitoring wells yet, but that's going to be a next step. So stay tuned for that. But this sort of sets this up. So minimum threshold is your definition of undesirable results. Interim milestones provide you with a little bit of a buffer and a prediction of how you're going to get to sustainability. In other words, staying above this minimum threshold. And the measure objective serves as an operational target. Maybe I'll stop there for a second and see if anybody has any questions related to the terminology. Okay, great. Here is an example that I've pulled from a GSP that I developed in the Kern County subbasin, working with the Kern River GSA. This just happens to be one of our monitoring wells from our GSP network. And sometimes I think it's helpful to see an example of how others have done things. This doesn't mean this has to be how we do it in the Turlock subbasin. It's just an example of how we did it in the Kern River GSA. Because we had the potential for undesirable results associated with our historic low water level, which had occurred in the drought of record in 2015 and 2016. And because this portion of the subbasin was already generally sustainable, we thought we could manage our water levels above this minimum threshold. So our minimum threshold in this well was set at the historic low water level to avoid undesirable results being below this orange line. We also thought, because we were pretty close to sustainability, that we could operate within the range of highs and lows that we had seen over our historical study period, which went back to 1995. So for this 23-year period, for this one representative monitoring well, we looked at our hydrograph and we said, okay, well, there is where we want to stay above. We've had some undesirable results associated with the adverse impacts in the drought, and thereby we're going to say our minimum threshold is here. Our high over time was in 1998 when we had a very wet year. And so a midpoint between our minimum threshold and the high water levels that we saw in the well became our measurable objective. This was just how we did it. You don't have to do it this way. You can move your measurable objective closer to your minimum threshold if you'd like. But by setting a measurable objective at a midpoint of what you've sort of determined to be your operational range of water levels, then you give yourself the opportunity to use a moving average over average hydrologic conditions. And even though water levels go up and down, fluctuate and have long-term trends, even though you have hard time kind of seeing where you are at one point like here, or seeing where you are at one point like here, if you are operating around your midpoint of your operational range, then you can be self-assured that you are moving in the direction of staying above this minimum threshold, even if you get into similar droughts that we've had in the recent past. So this just, again, sets up an operational range of water levels, a way of moving forward to make sure that you're operating within that range, and identification of the metric that you want to avoid. So again, minimum threshold, measurable objective, and in this particular case, an operational range of water levels.
Phyllis, this is Milt, and I do have
Hi,
a question regarding what you just spoke on. Okay,
Please.
You're talking about monitor wells. I've heard you mention 2 monitoring wells. That's going to be for the entire subbasin, Turlock subbasin, both east and west side, or did I misunderstand that?
You absolutely misunderstood that.
Okay,
Yeah,
it's more
I'm
than
so
2.
sorry
It's going to
if
be an average. It's going to be how many wells and
Yes, there will be many more than 2 wells, because we know that water levels change more than that over this subbasin. I say that, you know, as of course, but there could be some subbasins where water levels are relatively flat and you maybe don't need as many wells. But in this subbasin, we have a variety of water level, not only rates of decline, but we also have a variety of water levels over time and with different aquifers. And so as a result of that, we absolutely will have more than 2 monitoring points in the subbasin. And we may have more wells for the chronic lowering of water level sustainability indicator, for example, and less wells for a water quality, or less wells for a land subsidence. I think we talked a little bit about land subsidence. We're going to get into that in just a little bit here in this presentation as well. If you have an area that's more susceptible to land subsidence because of the geology and the hydrogeologic conditions that are susceptible for land subsidence, then you want more monitoring there, of course. And so we will craft the monitoring program. We'll work obviously with the joint tax and the GSAs to develop the monitoring program that's appropriate for each one of the sustainability indicators. But we're absolutely not going to base the world on 1 or 2 wells.
Okay, I like the word appropriate. So I want to see a lot of wells out there that really give us a scientific reading that really tells us what's happening in our subbasin.
You and I are on the same page. Thank you.
Phyllis,
Yes.
can you go back 1 slide? I have of using that minimum threshold as part of the operating range. Just knowing from 2015 when we were in the terrible drought and had to impose major restrictions, that bottoming out, it wasn't what I would consider an operating range. I know a lot of the wells in Modesto, Waterford, Hickman, and now Ceres are still suffering from that minimum that we see on this slide, which I know is not our basin, but it's. Oh, I just wanted to say that I don't know that our.
Yes, and so I think your comment is that for the circumstances that you're concerned about, using a minimum threshold here would not be appropriate, that you would need it higher.
I think so. I know in Ceres right now we're suffering from the wells having falling water, plug perforations, and water pressure. There's probably 4 wells in Ceres out of 13 active wells that have really lost their ability to have a good yield that they did in the 90s when they were put in.
Okay, that's a good comment. We haven't yet set the minimum thresholds for the Turlock subbasin, but we will be talking about that going forward. So, well noted. Thanks.
Yeah, and Phyllis, this is Michael.
Hi.
I'd 100% echo Karen's approach. I don't think the historic low that you show there should be the minimum. The minimum should be above our historic low for the bottom of the operational range. It just, I think one of your comments in one of your memos was talking about the volume of groundwater, and we've only drawn out X%. There's so much left, we could draw it down even further. I don't see things that way. I think water levels are a critical component, and we need to set our minimum well above that historic low.
Great, thank you for the comment. And let me clarify something, Michael. So what I've done in the memo is treat each one of the sustainability indicators separately, just for the purposes of dealing with each of the sort of individual components associated with the different 6 components. And so what you read with respect to the percentage of water that had been in storage in the subbasin was related specifically to the reduction of groundwater and storage. And the question there was, are you depleting your water supply, your overall water supply? Are you depleting it such that that you no longer have the supply, the total supply necessary to meet your demands? And that's a different question than are you impacting beneficial uses in existing wells such that you can access that supply. Does that distinction make sense, what I just said? Maybe.
I'll be honest, Phyllis, for me, no, it doesn't, because when you reduce the volume, you reduce the level.
Absolutely related. They're absolutely related. But you, at least in the one instance, have more supply beneath you. That doesn't mean that you can continue to decline to use that, because you have another sustainability indicator, which is chronic lowering of water levels, of which you have identified adverse impacts associated with a certain level. So for one indicator, your minimum threshold needs to be higher. For the other indicator, your minimum threshold could potentially be lower were it not for the first. And the first one would control, because that's the higher level. Does that make sense?
Otherwise you got competing criteria, and which one prevails? But it looks like you said
yes, exactly. And you know, to be honest with you, you know, we've talked about this as well. And if I don't have this clear in the written product, then help me make that clear. Please make that comment when you provide comments on the written memo, because we have talked about in previous meetings on sustainable management criteria that whatever we set for chronic lowering of water levels, let's pretend for just the sake of looking at a hydrograph that it's here. If this is set here, then this will automatically protect you from depleting supply. Even if you could have set your minimum threshold way down here for the supply portion, for the supply indicator, you don't have to do it, because you've already set your water level here. And because the two are related, and because you are already being controlled by this level, you can simply say for reduction of groundwater and storage, we are completely protected, and we will adopt the minimum threshold being used for the chronic lowering of water level, for example. So there's a variety of ways to go about this. I tried to separate them out at first, but you're absolutely right. They're all linked, and ultimately one will control. And part of the reason for moving and pushing so hard on the sustainable yield is I think we're going to get to a point where that's really going to control a lot of our sustainable management criteria.
Phyllis, I'm sorry, I have one more question. I lost internet connection for a minute, so I wasn't able to comment earlier. When we're looking at the per capita use for the cities, the urban areas,
yes.
When we're looking at that data, is there anything comparable to how much water the crops take. I don't know if there's like a, gallon per acre or.
An acre foot per acre. Yes, so that's already embedded in the model, and that's already calculated directly by the model. And unless we change crop type or cropping patterns in the subbasin substantially, in other words, if we use current use, then the model does that without us doing anything differently. But with respect to the urban portion of the model operates on population and per capita water use. So those are the two things that go into the model for that. The applied water that each crop needs is already embedded in the model, and that will stay the same going forward unless someone has something that they want to change.
Understood. Thank you for clearing.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. Okay, so we've talked about the terminology. We've talked about how it might be applied to an actual well. We've acknowledged that we're going to have more than one representative monitoring well. And we've also talked about how we're going to do this for each one of the sustainability indicators, but in reality, when we have one that is the shallowmost minimum threshold, will control the others. Now, I just wanted to again review the concept of how these minimum thresholds that are set at the monitoring wells can be combined and work together to better understand and define undesirable results. And this simply has to do with changes in location, where some lower levels might be tolerated in some areas and not in others. It has to do with not relying on one well and one measurement at one time to put the whole subbasin into non-compliance, which wouldn't make any sense at all. And so the regulations anticipate and actually provide examples in their best management practices for the combination of minimum threshold exceedances to incorporate into the definition of undesirable result. So one minimum threshold exceedance in one well does not necessarily trigger undesirable results. You have to think that through yourself. And the little process diagram or little decision tree that we see is shown here as an example. Again, this is from DWR. And what happens here is that you have, let's say, a minimum threshold that you have set for your chronic lowering of water level sustainability indicator number 1 is shown here. So if we are monitoring and applying our minimum threshold standard throughout our entire GSP, then we will monitor that well. We're going to review the data. We've already considered beneficial uses and users of groundwater, and we've set a minimum threshold, which is this specific metric. Now, if we exceed it, that's where we begin to apply this sort of combination definition of undesirable results. So let's say that what we have done is we've already put together our sustainable management criteria, and then we've gone out and monitored our well, and then we have a well that has exceeded the minimum threshold. And this question is asked at any representative monitoring well: are there minimum thresholds exceeded? No, just is clear, no undesirable results. We don't have to worry about that well for that time period, and we move forward. But if we do have a well where the answer is yes, we have gone below the orange line that we saw, for example, on the hydrograph on the previous slide, then we ask ourselves, well, does any combination of these exceedances constitute your locally defined, you define it, significant and unreasonable, undesirable result? And if the answer to that is yes, then that's where you are out of compliance with respect to SGMA, unless you're in the implementation period where you have already anticipated that you will have a combination that will go below this minimum threshold. But for the most part, we're talking here about after we are sustainably managing the basin. And if this combination, if the answer to this combination is no, then of course no undesirable results. But if you have, let's say for example, that you have said, we're going to define our minimum threshold at a certain level, and we have 10 or 12 wells in these well fields in this area, and we want to be able to manage them such that our undesirable results are avoided. And as a result of that, we might, as Karen suggested, set our minimum threshold a little higher to protect our wells more than they are being protected when we had our undesirable results in the drought. And so, but we might be able to manage it if one well exceeds that minimum threshold. Maybe we can manage it if 2 wells exceed the minimum threshold. But if 3 wells actually exceed it, then that may be what is incorporated into the locally defined significant and unreasonable effect. So this just illustrates again how you can, it gets more complicated, but it gives you more flexibility from the standpoint of agencies operating your groundwater basin. And it just simply is all based on the concept that one well does not make the undesirable result. This gives you, again, some flexibility in operations and the opportunity to manage the groundwater basin. Okay, anything on that before we move on? That was a little bit of a tricky slide to explain, so if I've confused anyone, let me know. And it might also be helpful if we go to an example. So let's look at Merced Subbasin Sustainable Management Criteria, and they've put together a very handy table that I pulled directly from their groundwater sustainability plan. And this is simply how Merced has done it. Doesn't mean this is how we will do it. It means that this is an example of what we see in the adjacent subbasin. And so what we see are each of the 6 sustainability indicators. And for each of those, here is the minimum threshold that has been developed, the measurable objective that's been developed, and the undesirable result definition. These are actually in some cases shown as a metric, which is the milligrams per liter number. In some cases, they are shown not as a metric, but they are shown as an approach. And the reason that is because for groundwater levels, there might be a different actual water level designated at each one of the wells. So it wouldn't be the same at every well in the same way that the water quality is, rather it would be different. And as a result of that, here is the approach that is used to define where that minimum threshold is. And in this particular case, the Merced Basin determined that it was either the depth of a close shallow well, because we want to protect wells to the extent possible, or it was a representative monitoring well that had been determined as of before January 1st, 2015, some elevation that was determined to be a minimum threshold, in the same way that we just looked at that orange line on the hydrograph for the previous slide. They actually used modeling to help them a little bit with their measurable objective. And then here is where this combination comes in, that when they look at their minimum threshold for each one of the wells, if those minimum thresholds are exceeded in more than a quarter of their representative wells, and if it falls below that minimum threshold in 2 consecutive years, and there's a little bit of additional nuance here to look at 2 consecutive years that are similar in hydrology, then that is their undesirable result. In other words, if 24% of their wells, I'm making up a number here, it's probably, you probably have the number of wells that you can't really parse into 1%, but let's say that 24% of the wells fall below the minimum thresholds, even in 2 consecutive years, that would not be undesirable results. If 25% fell beneath the minimum threshold one time, and then in the next time that you monitored it, it was above it, then that would again not be the undesirable result. So this is a way of incorporating space and time into the definition of undesirable results. Groundwater storage, they concluded, as did I, in the memo that you received, that this is less applicable just because there is so much fresh water in storage. We're in the middle of a Central Valley. We have a very deep aquifer, and very lucky to have the thickness of groundwater resources that we have. As Michael points out, losing groundwater out of storage is not something that we want to do. And the manifestation of losing groundwater out of storage is that we lower our water levels. But we handle that here. And so just looking at the supply and whether or not the supply has been deleted, that's what Merced is talking about when they say not applicable, not present, and not likely to occur, simply because there is so much groundwater in storage. This reduction of groundwater in storage is interpreted by many in different ways. And for the critically overdrafted basins, you can see a variety of how this sustainability indicator was used. But for the most part, in the Central Valley in particular, most GSPs treat this sustainability indicator simply from a depletion of supply perspective. So, water intrusion, I don't want to, I'm sorry, somebody had a question?
Hi, Phyllis. This is Debbie with the TID. So my question is, have we heard anything from DWR with respect to how they're interpreting the groundwater storage sustainability indicator, and if you're able to indicate that it's, quote, not applicable?
No, we haven't, and DWR will be glad to have conversations with you about it, and then they will tell you that this needs to be locally defined.
Sure.
So there really isn't any guidance beyond what they've already given us in their best management practices. I was concerned about it in particular because I treated this differently in a GSP that I did for a critically overdrafted basin. And the way that I looked at reduction of groundwater in storage is that feels to me as if a negative change in groundwater in storage is overdraft. So I was specifically treating this sustainability indicator in the concept of overdraft. I still believe that is a reasonable way to look at it. However, I do note that the best management practices seems to lean in the direction of depletion of supply rather than a balance of the basin. And the bottom line here is this: it does not matter whether you use overdraft to relate to this sustainability indicator or you use it in the concept of the sustainable yield. Either way, you have to deal with overdraft. So by not including it in this sustainability indicator, I'm simply trying to be a little more consistent with the adjacent subbasins that surround us here and rather treat it separately as sustainable yield. Either way, it gets treated. Either way, the basin must operate sustainably by being in balance.
I have a question. This is Karen with Ceres. So are they looking at groundwater storage as the aquifer's ability to hold water, and if there is a loss of that's what would indicate whether or not it's applicable or not?
Yes, and there are places in California where groundwater basins are, especially those that are associated with an almost upland river area where you have shallow alluvium that is surrounded on both sides and underneath by bedrock. And so you do have the potential there of actually depleting your supply. In other words, you could draw water levels down so low in the aquifer that there's simply not enough supply to put another well in to get it. Do you see what I mean? Maybe not. Did that make sense?
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, I just don't know how we can say that we don't have a groundwater storage problem when we have lowering groundwater levels. Can you help explain again?
Yes, and I'm going to refer you to a figure that we looked at a long time ago, and I wish I had pulled it up here. When we looked at our cross sections that we did in the sub-basin, we saw, and we put the water levels on those cross sections, we saw that we had about 1,000 feet or so, and it varies dramatically over the sub-basin, but I'm going to just say in some areas of the West, at least 1,000 feet of saturated groundwater, saturated sediments. And over the last 25-year period, we have lowered water levels associated with that 1,000 feet of saturated sediments about 80 feet. So a 25-year period, if you lose 80 feet, it's a relatively small percentage of the overall supply. Whereas in some areas, when you have a much shallower groundwater basin and or a much thinner column of fresh water, you don't have as many options. You can't just drill a deeper well. The supply isn't there.
Okay, thank you.
And again, I think from a local control perspective, if we want to include overdraft as part of the groundwater storage sustainability indicator, we can. Again, it's going to be handled either way, and it's just a matter of whether we write it up in the chapter as sustainable yield, or if we put it in a balanced groundwater basin in this sustainability indicator. Either way, I think it works. I'm going to move on for this. So we talked a lot about seawater intrusion, so I'm just going to skip on down. For degraded water quality, we've identified some constituents of concern in the sub-basin. In particular, Merced identified total dissolved solids. I don't think that's going to be one of our constituents of concern, even though we do have some localized issues associated with that. Most of the details that I have seen have more to do with arsenic as being a constituent of concern. I know there are others, we've made lists, but I'm just thinking about sort of something that's widespread and something that has increasing in elevated concentrations over a larger area. There may be others. At any rate, the example from Merced is using TDS, and they are saying that if they have representative monitoring wells, a quarter of them, 2 years exceeding the 1,000 milligram per liter TDS threshold, then that's their definition of undesirable results. And they'd like to operate and keep their basin around the 500 milligram total dissolved solid level. There's nothing wrong with this. I think at some point as managers of this groundwater basin, we all need to ask ourselves what can be done and what should be done with respect to how to manage the basin. The trying to clean up, so to speak, or to do something different with respect to some of these constituents that are naturally occurring are very difficult. And rather, in most subbasins, they're managed with best management practices to make sure that we don't make things worse. And we manage it with respect to our wells so that we don't inadvertently cause larger areas of groundwater to be degraded than would otherwise occur. With respect to land subsidence, we've talked a little bit about that already, and now you have a memo to read a little bit more about that. It summarizes pretty much what we have already said, and I think we reviewed this last time, so I'll just mention it again, that the Merced Subbasin had selected a rate of land subsidence as their minimum threshold and a measurable objective above that. And then here's their combination, the exceedance of the minimum threshold at 3 or more representative sites over 2 consecutive years. So this is the combination, the space and time portion that goes into the undesirable result definition. And then minimum thresholds are what you want to avoid, and measurable objectives is where you want to be. And then interconnected surface waters, they simply used groundwater levels as a proxy. So what that means, that's similar to what we were talking about before with Michael's question, when we said that if we set a minimum threshold at a certain level in a certain well for this indicator, and it is protective of this indicator, then we can just say we're going to follow along with that. So that's how a lot of these all relate together. You may treat them separately in the beginning, but ultimately they all work together. Any questions on that?
Yeah.
For
So this is Michael. To my earlier thought, and also kind of Karen made me think about this too. So the whole groundwater storage thing, where does sustainable yield play into that? Because I'm thinking if you stay within your sustainable yield, you're not going to be having an adverse impact on groundwater storage. So where does sustainable yield play into those sustainability factors or indicators?
Yeah. And that's exactly how I've looked at it in the past, and that's what I have written in the groundwater sustainability plans that I have participated in so far. Having said that, whether it is written as part of the groundwater storage sustainability indicator or as a separate item, simply being sustainable yield, either way, the regulations require it.
Okay, thank you.
And when we get off of this call, I can send you there. DWR has a best management practices guidance document for sustainable management criteria. And in that document, they deal with this sort of, sort of outside issue of overdraft. And they have a little call out box, and they specifically talk about sustainable yield and how it is related to the water budgets and how it is a target for your projects and management actions in ways of bringing this basin into balance, but that it's not dealt with directly as a sustainability indicator. And it was really because of that call box that I backed off of including it in this sustainability indicator, even though I think from a hydrogeological perspective, it makes infinite sense that groundwater and storage is the same thing as your water budget.
Phyllis?
Yes.
Just not to beat this to death, I'm looking, I can finally zoom in. I can look at the Merced example. When they did their minimum threshold for groundwater levels, it looks like they took like a sampling of wells and said, we'll sample around that and kind of go from there. Is that because they didn't have that many wells to go on? Or, because I'm thinking one well could not be very reliable in terms of showing average well depths. It just goes, like in my previous position, we have two wells maybe half a mile apart, and they'd show radically different water, not radically different, but significantly different water levels.
Yes.
So we've only got a few representative wells over a large area. Are you really showing what you need to show in terms of minimum threshold? Because you may get to the point where you've gone below it, it's too late, and you're having impacts, but you never really measured them because you're using the wrong wells.
Yeah, and selecting wells that give us a better understanding of the aquifer system is part of our challenge to put together our GSP monitoring network. And I can tell you that for some of the overdrafted basins that have already begun implemented their monitoring program, there are already wells that are being deleted and added even as we speak today that are not working out with respect to being able to either be accessed or giving us faulty readings, or they were actually production wells and somebody turned the pump on before they took the level. And so there are a variety of criteria that we're going to be using. The bottom line is this: we don't have a perfect monitoring system, nor are we going to have one in the short term. It's something that we're going to develop over time. You have a start with the CASGEM monitoring wells. I understand there are some issues associated with the CASGEM wells, and I also am aware that the CASGEM wells construction information is not always known. And so we're gonna need to deal with that. But to the extent that we can, we're gonna find the most representative wells that we can find. The water data library for the Turlock Subbasin has water levels that go, I don't know what the numbers are, but certainly span decades and provide us with a lot of hydrograph information similar to the hydrograph you're looking at here. And we presented that information in the basin setting. We compared a lot of the hydrographs. I think we made more than 400 hydrographs in the basin. And we compared those hydrographs one to another to get representative hydrographs in certain portions of the basin. And that part of it has already been done with respect to the basin setting analysis that all of you have seen drafts of. And so we will do something similar to that, but a little more specific. And we're actually going to start that now because we have a round 3 grant that's going to provide us with some funding for additional wells. And we only have a few in the west. And then I think that the Eastern Turlock Subbasin GSA has identified key areas in their subbasin for additional wells there. But given that we have a limited number of wells, we want to make sure that they're in the right place. So we're going to be looking at the CASGEM wells, looking at other monitoring programs, identifying locations that we really need a location for now, maybe targeting those for the new wells, and then improving everything as we go forward. And frankly, if there is any subbasin in the Central Valley that did not have as one of their management actions that they were going to improve their GSP monitoring network over time, then they probably should have. So it's a work in progress. Does that make sense? I'm going to take silence.
Yeah, I think we're good to go.
Okay. Thanks very much for the discussion. It's really nice and helpful, FYI, to have these questions and comments. I think this is exactly what we've been missing, and this is what I'd like to see the joint tax do a little bit more of, and I think it will move us forward in a much more rapid pace here. Okay, so that's my review of the terminology, and I'm going to move now to the memo which I provided, which was the definition of desirable results. I just have a couple of slides on this. I think the memo speaks for itself. I see this as a working memo. I see these sometimes when I put something down on paper, it gives you something to react to. And so rather than having all of the joint TAC members have to start from scratch in developing some of these definitions, I just took the opportunity to begin that process. It doesn't mean I'm right. It doesn't mean that these are final. It means that this is the beginning. And so I'd like to just quickly go through these now. These are the definitions that I put forth for undesirable results. This is based on what I've heard from all of the discussions that we've had on this from all of you, beginning with monitoring of water levels. You can see there that we're dealing specifically with water level decline, such that water supply wells are adversely impacted, especially during multi-year droughts, in a manner that cannot be readily managed or mitigated. And I think that represents, at least in my mind, what I've heard in our discussions on adverse impacts. We have talked quite a bit in this conversation already about the second sustainability indicator, reduction of groundwater and storage. You can see my reasoning here. I did it more to coordinate with our adjacent subbasin than anything else. But if we want to incorporate the concept of overdraft into this sustainability indicator, then I see no reason why we can't do that. The seawater intrusion, we've really talked a lot about that, so we're going to move forward there. For degraded water quality, I think that this had some nuances in it that I wanted to point out. So this is the definition of undesirable results that would occur when significant and unreasonable impacts to groundwater quality as caused by the water management actions affects the beneficial use of groundwater for overlier users. There are a myriad of water quality programs in place. The State Water Resources Control Board and the regional water boards are the principal agencies responsible for water quality. And we neither have the mandate nor the authority under SGMA to duplicate those programs. We do, however, need to manage the subbasins such that water quality is not degraded, in particular by the management of the subbasin. I think, Michael, you had an excellent example last time in where the city operates its well field such that the local contamination of PCE is not impacted by your pumping. The regional board is moving in the direction of having those contaminants cleaned up and having the dischargers address those issues. And in the meantime, we want to, number one, avoid them, and number two, not make it worse. So that's sort of my overall take of that sustainability indicator. Moving to inelastic land subsidence, going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but that again relates back to an adverse impact on land use. And I borrowed this directly from the Merced subbasin because I like the words. The concept of an undesirable result would reduce the viability of the use. It's a little wordy, but it's important because what it means is that that the use of the critical infrastructure is impacted. And that, in turn, I think you would have to admit, is going to affect land use. Critical infrastructure is to be determined, but we've talked a lot about what the term critical infrastructure involves: roadways, pipelines, utilities, canals. And again, I've got some examples of this that we're going to talk about in just a second, so hang with me on that. And then finally, we are modeling the surface water depletions with our projected water budgets, and we can look at those with respect to management actions and projects and consider potential impacts to land uses associated with that. Water levels can also serve as a proxy for this. That's what Merced did, and we might want to do the same thing here. So in addition to these sort of working definitions, we have here my general working framework for this whole concept of combination of space and time. I don't expect any of these X's and numbers to be filled in until we get the GSP monitoring network sort of a little bit viable and in place. So I think that's where a lot of these terms and combinations of wells can be reviewed, so that we make sure that we're protecting the areas that really need to be protected. I won't go through each of those because, again, there's just a lot of it's a framework. And, you know, we have the word two here. That could be three, that could be one, depending on where we land with respect to how we're going to monitor subsidence, for example. So these are provided for your review and thoughts. And I am hoping that the TAC members will give us some comments back. Either comments that this seems reasonable, or I have a question about this, or your concerns about whether or not the reduction in groundwater and storage can really be managed in the way that is provided in the memo. And then this will provide me some feedback, and it will help our technical team know best how to help you with respect to moving this forward. So would appreciate written comments in any way, form, or shape that you can. If you want to talk about them, call me directly, so that we can really begin the conversation more interactively. The the minimum threshold selection will be facilitated by the water budget modeling, but we can also begin some of that now with respect to working on hydrographs in the same way that you just saw a hydrograph that we had used in Kern County. And in beginning that process of working on hydrographs, we will begin identification of potential monitoring wells for incorporation into the GSP program. We may as well start that now. I'm going to be looking at the CASGEM wells to see which ones might be appropriate or which might be problematic. I'm going to be working with the two monitoring entities to help me with that because they have good understanding of how that is. FYI, and I think everyone already knows this, but the CASGEM program is going away. So what's going to happen with the Sigma portal is that DWR is going to migrate any CASGEM well that you're planning to use in your Sigma monitoring program over to the Sigma portal right away. And that will happen when we submit our monitoring network. And the CASGEM well will come over. It will have all of its data from the CASGEM program coming with it. That is an excellent time. I know there were some concerns that some of the CASGEM wells had inappropriate attributes and they've been a pain to fix in the past. But if we use those wells in the GSP monitoring program and we bring them over, migrate them over to the Sigma portal, that will be an easy and excellent time to make any corrections to well attributes that we wish to do at that time. Any of the remaining wells that are sitting on the CASGEM portal that will not be identified as Sigma monitoring wells will be designated as voluntary wells and will be eventually all migrated over to the Sigma portal as well, but they will just simply not be updated over time. DWR has pretty much suspended their monitoring efforts. They were still doing some monitoring in Central Valley subbasins, and my understanding is that that has now ceased. So the Sigma monitoring programs and the data being migrated over from the CASGEM program will be providing the information needed going forward for water levels in the Central Valley. So that's a long-winded explanation of our potential use of CASGEM wells. And then there might be additional wells that we want. We need long-term access to those wells. So some people are reluctant. They don't mind you coming and taking a water level from time to time, but they're reluctant to give you a long-term access. And we really need a long-term access to be able to incorporate into the program. And then coordinate with other programs. The Eastern Turlock Subbasin GSA in particular has done work to get TSS funding in the Turlock Subbasin. I'm not 100% sure of the status of that, but my understanding is that it's at least still in the queue and moving forward. And then we can look at this information and perhaps optimize some targeted locations for monitoring wells under the DWR grant. I think the Eastern Turlock Subbasin has already done this, and we will incorporate what they've done. And then there's the opportunity to get a couple of additional wells in the Western Subbasin as well. Any other questions and comments before I move to land subsidence? We are almost done.
Hi, it's Spreck Rose. Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Phyllis, you talked about the fact that many of these GSAs were only monitoring groundwater elevations and not volume. And of the critically drafted basins that have submitted their plans, can you roughly say how many have done that just on volume or just on elevation, not on volume, and how many have incorporated volume explicitly as a undesirable result?
I'm sorry, I can't. I've not focused on that, Spreck. I've looked at a lot of plans, but I guess I just don't have a sense of how to exactly answer that. I certainly can do it for the ones I know, but I just don't know how everybody else is handling that. I've not focused on that before.
Well, can you, of the ones you know, has it been mostly just the elevation, or has it been a variety?
Well, okay, so I can tell you a lot about the Kern River Groundwater Sustainability Plan because I worked on that almost exclusively over the last few years. And in that plan, we are dealing with almost every one of the sustainability indicators using water levels as a proxy. but the water levels are specifically tied in each case back to some aspect. So for example, chronic lowering of water levels, the water levels are tied to the declines in the subbasin. For reduction of groundwater and storage, the water levels are tied back directly to volumes of groundwater. And in the case of the Kern River GSA, I dealt specifically with overdraft in that sustainability indicator. For degraded water quality, we saw that at depth we had arsenic and uranium issues, and there was sufficient information for me to actually do water level correlations to arsenic MCLs in some ways better than we could use the concentration of arsenic itself, even though arsenic was continued to be monitored. So even for the degraded water quality, water levels could be used as a proxy in that particular situation. But each one of these water levels, and then also for land subsidence, we did that as well. But for each sustainability indicator, the water level designated at the monitoring well was different. And it had a different objective, and it was linked to a different metric. Did that make sense?
It sounds like it's complicated.
Even the bottom line of all of it is this. Even though water levels are still the primary method and measurement of the GSP monitoring network, even though water levels are the primary that's coming out of them, it's related back to each of the sustainability indicators for protection and sustainable management. So it provides you with an opportunity to tie water levels back to management of the subbasin in a variety of ways. And in reality, they're all linked. So it made sense to us, and it seems to be working okay so far. We've only gone through about 6 months of monitoring so far, but I think it's a reasonable approach. That doesn't mean that the water budgets don't have to be done first. They do, and they have to be very detailed in order to get back to how you can monitor for them with water levels. Same with land subsidence, same with interconnected surface water. But the water levels are, number one, they're straightforward to obtain. People are used to doing it. They have high integrity of data, meaning you can't mess them up in the same way that you can mess up some additional monitoring, for example, in an extensometer. They provide reasonable indicators for each one of these sustainability components, and I think it's a streamlined and very cost-effective way to manage a groundwater basin. It can't be done everywhere, but when it can be done and it can be linked directly back to what you're trying to understand and measure, it works well.
Yeah, I would just say I understand that it's easier to measure and more straightforward, and just would point out that it's if you want to look into recharge possibilities, you have to know sort of how much room there is, because you can estimate what you might get in a flood year, that sort of stuff in terms of volume. But if you want to try and put it back in the ground, the elevation enough is enough to give you an idea of whether a certain recharge possibility is feasible or not.
Yeah, so my firm obviously is a groundwater banking firm. We've been doing managed aquifer recharge as long as our firm has been in place, relating back to our very first project, which was for the United Nations and managed aquifer recharge. And in all cases that we have done recharge projects, there's a variety of things that are specific to that particular project that needs to be known, and certainly more information that needs to be gathered with respect to investigations. Water levels, however, are still the major item that gives you a better understanding. I mean, when you talk about a groundwater mound and the formation of the mound and the dissipation of the mound, it's all water level driven. When you talk about storage components. The first thing you need to know is what's your depth to water. So it's all related, and I don't doubt for a second that that there are so many other things that need to be monitored and managed. But from the standpoint of understanding the groundwater basin, a very robust water level monitoring program will get you pretty far.
Thank you.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about land subsidence. This is a concept slide. I just put it up because it would kind of remind us of what we had talked about last time with respect to what land subsidence is and how in the Turlock Subbasin we are looking at the Corcoran Clay in particular as being susceptible to potential future subsidence. The technical memorandum that is now available for review was the TAC members asked the technical team if they could put together some information on this sustainability indicator into a memorandum to provide some written product to react to, and specifically asked for examples of undesirable result definitions. When we talked last week about, I'm sorry, not last week, but at the last meeting about the definition of undesirable results for land subsidence that the Merced Subbasin had developed, I think there was the question of, you know, what have others done? Have others dealt with this in a similar manner? So I've pulled together some examples and I put those in the draft memorandum. I pulled what I thought was relevant. I'm sure there are more. And if there are other issues and other things that need to be addressed, happy to move that forward. But I think this is a good starting place. So we talked last week about the example from Merced. I put it up again because, again, I think it is very applicable to the Turlock Subbasin. I think it's applicable because it's the same conceptual picture with respect to the Corcoran Clay and the principal aquifers above and below and the susceptibility of water level declines associated at the Corcoran Clay level. And it's also similar with respect to land use. It has maybe some similar critical infrastructure that needs to be protected from potential for future land subsidence. So again, I think it is applicable. And if you looked at the memorandum on the definitions of undesirable results, which we just talked about, you can see that I've borrowed heavily from what was defined for Merced. They have their monitoring station are these geodetic network points that are being monitored by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And they have set their combination of space and time undesirable result definition up as such, where 3 of 4 of their 4 monitoring points over 2 consecutive years for similar hydrology exceeds their minimum threshold, which just happens to be this negative 7.75 feet. When that happens, that's their definition of undesirable result. So that's when they have to worry about compliance with SGMA. There are a lot of other examples that I have added. I tried to do this. I tried to stay on the east side of the Central Valley for a variety of reasons. Reason number one is a lot of the subsidence that we see on the west side is complicated by other mechanisms. There are some collapsible surficial deposits in that area, and there are older unconsolidated materials that behave a little bit differently than dewatering of the Corcoran Clay. So I sort of tried to stay along the area where I thought the subsidence mechanisms were more similar to what we see in the Merced Subbasin and what we want to protect against in the Turlock Subbasin. So the ones that I pulled, Merced you just saw, I pulled Chowchilla, which also shares some of the lowering of land surface that was seen in the Merced Subbasin. And then I came down here to the area, you know, I had some people ask me last time after the discussion about the Corcoran Clay and how it got its name and what it was. And we talked a little bit about that. And I know that most people know where the town of Corcoran or the community of Corcoran is in this area. This is where this clay was originally defined geologically. And it's also an area of some of the most intense subsidence that we see along the Central Valley. So I pulled the Greater Kauai and Mid Kauai GSPs to see what they had to say about land subsidence in the area, and also Tulare Lake. A lot of this subsidence that you see here is also in Tule, and I didn't pull Tule. I was thinking that Tulare Lake probably covered some of it, but what you'll see when you look at the Tulare Lake is that they talk about the coordination of subsidence with the Tule subbasin. So there's a little bit included in there. So here's the list of the 5 GSPs, Merced, of which you've already seen. And then the memorandum has attachment 1 that shows the definition of undesirable results for these additional GSPs. And I just put some observations here. You can read those examples for yourself, and you may have different observations. But essentially, I think that some of the things that are most important for us are things like if we set MTs in the area of the Corcoran Clay close to historic lows, then we at that point are beginning to mitigate the potential for future subsidence, because to have future subsidence in that subbasin, we would need to see water levels go lower than the historic low. In areas where critical infrastructure has already been impacted, and I think this comes from Chowchilla, you know, they just simply include in their definition continued subsidence in the areas where critical infrastructure has already been impacted is just plain unacceptable, of course. And so you can see those kinds of things in areas where they have had some difficulty with subsidence. Some GSPs suggest that water levels are hard to correlate to rates of subsidence. They cite the challenges of long screens, unknown well construction, and local water levels that are not indicative of the regional problem. In this particular case, however, what they're trying to do is to relate a change in water level to a specific rate of subsidence. That's tough to do. But in this particular case here, when water levels are being used for subsidence, if you can stay above where they have already been, that's a little bit different. You're not trying to relate the amount of change back to a rate. Rather, you're just simply mitigating the future problem. The minimum thresholds always rely on more than one monitoring point, recognizing that inelastic land subsidence is a regional issue. And all of these areas recognize the need to coordinate with adjacent subbasins, especially down here where you have a lot of subsidence crossing subbasin boundaries, not so much in our area. And then this was an interesting bullet that I added to the bottom here. Even in areas where there has been substantial land subsidence, there aren't as many critical infrastructure impacts and land use impacts as you might think. But the one thing that has been identified as being very damaging is when there's differential land subsidence. So I think when you start to think about differential land subsidence, you start to think about that there are areas where either the nature of the clay is different with respect to thickness or properties, and you also begin to think about how there are localized groundwater declines. So I thought that was a little bit of a nuance that was an interesting concept that was identified in some of these additional definitions. So I will leave that for you to review at your leisure. This is the monitoring network. Moving now to monitoring for a second. I did include some information on monitoring in the technical memorandum because I would like for us to think about how we might want to handle it for the Turlock Subbasin. Merced had the opportunity to incorporate 4 of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation monitoring points. These are monitored semi-annual in their geodetic network. And they do, since 2011, they've been monitoring the one in Turlock as well. So we do have the opportunity to incorporate that into your monitoring network. That would simply mean twice a year someone is responsible for downloading the data and analyzing it with respect to minimum thresholds. So finally, just some additional, I showed this slide last time. I've cleaned it up a little bit, but it again lays out some of the options for monitoring strategies for you in this subbasin. I just mentioned the USBR monitoring station, which is shown here. It's an appropriate location given that it's overlies the area of the Corcoran Clay in the subbasin. There's the potential for using online DWR INSAR data for screening. That's what's shown here by this color-coded vertical displacement map that's on this slide. There's also the potential for installation of direct monitoring locations and points. The first of which is really a very inexpensive method to set up a continuous GPS station. You can also just simply survey benchmarks. That's another way of getting at whether or not the land is subsiding. And I know that several of the agencies have surveying, quite sophisticated surveying capabilities. So it could be that there's something that could be added to the monitoring network with respect to that. There's also the potential for using extensometers. These are just a little bit more expensive and a little more complicated, but they're relied on up and down the Central Valley. So it's a proven technology. And then using water levels as a proxy is what I had suggested, especially if we are going to define for some areas the minimum threshold as being at or near the historic lows, then that really sort of takes care of land subsidence monitoring in and of itself, because by staying above that minimum threshold, we would mitigate the potential for future subsidence. So I have summarized that in the memorandum, and would like to have your comments on that if you'd like to do so. I think that if we could get the joint TAC members to review these memorandum, I've provided something that you can react to and look at and tell me what you think is wrong and what you'd like to revise. These are provided simply in the spirit of beginning the details, so beginning the conversation. In addition to comments on the two memorandum that you have in front of you, we're going to continue to do the projected water budgets and sustainable yield analysis. We really need to get the data wrapped up on that as soon as possible. I'm trying to push the modeling team to get us results by August. We really need that in front of us as soon as possible. So we want to make this a big priority. And then as we begin to select preliminary sustainable management criteria, that's where we're going to actually need the wells, need the monitoring wells and some of the data there. So we'll start that process at this next TAC meeting coming up in a couple of weeks. Following that, we really need to get to projects and management actions. I know that some of that has already been started within the GSAs, and I'm glad because when we hit the ground running with respect to the sustainable yield analysis and finalizing our ongoing discussions of sustainable yield and also sustainable management criteria, we really need to get to what it is we need to do to balance the subbasin. Okay, thank you very much for hanging in there with me. I know I give long presentations with a lot of detail, but I really am only trying to provide you with a sufficient amount of information that you need to be able to comment and begin to make these difficult decisions together. So Michael, I think if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer it.
No, thank you, Phyllis. I appreciate the two memos and as well as your slideshow. And if you've been following on the chat, Herb has uploaded your PowerPoint deck to the website. So I encourage all of you to download that. And again, if you have comments on the things that Phyllis had in her slideshow too, make notes and everything. We need to get things to Phyllis by July 20th. Obviously, time is ticking. on getting the GSP put together. And the sooner we start giving direction to Phyllis and her team, the more quickly we can, flesh out the bones of the GSP. So if everybody could take those deadlines seriously and get all your comments as best you can to Phyllis. Obviously, there's a little bit of an iterative process. This won't be your only chance to comment, but let's start providing direction to Phyllis as quickly as possible. Oh, nice dog, Phyllis.
Thank you.
Okay. No problem. Anything else on that? Okay, let's go back to the agenda. So that took care of 6 and 7.
Michael, this is
Kevin,
Can
go
I
ahead.
interrupt for just a quick question to Phyllis? Phyllis, in our comments on the land subsidence, do you want us to suggest places for location of monitoring?
Yes, thank you. That would be great.
Okay. Because, the airport's an obvious easy one because they monitor all the time.
The airport is a very good critical infrastructure identification. Thank you. That CTAC members, we've already identified some of our critical infrastructure. That's great. Thanks, Kevin.
Sure.
Okay, because this is a special meeting, we don't have a normal kind of stuff at the end here. So we covered the agenda. But as we're all here, if we do have anything to add before we head on out here, our next meeting is scheduled for July 23rd. Anything from anybody before we close these meetings or this meeting? All right, but that sounds like unanimous consent to close the meeting. So for the West Turlock Subbasin, can I get a motion to adjourn from somebody, please?
This is Karen from Series. I'll motion to adjourn.
Motion from Series, second from somebody.
This is Debbie with the TID. I'll
Okay,
second.
Debbie, second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Okay, West Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committee, we are adjourned. Kevin?
Thank you, Michael. Dennis, are you there?
Yeah, I'll move to adjourn.
Thank you. The East Side's adjourned.
Okay, so see you all again on July 23rd. Thank you, everybody.